Boa tarde a todas, todos, todes. I will speak in English because we have a distinguished panel here that speaks mostly English. And we have Jin Liqun, the president of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Laurence Tubiana, the CEO of the European Climate Foundation, and Júlia Forlani, strategic partnership specialist at the Amazônia Mais 21 Institute. This panel here, we are going to be talking about the climate finance, which is, as we discussed before here in the previous panels, the key topic, as Ministra Marina was mentioning, of the COP29. Along with the G20 currently, a lot of the conversations on the climate finance is how we can also consider reforms on the architecture of finance in general, to address climate change and also promote just transition, considering particularly the need for scaling significantly finance for climate for those who are most vulnerable and poorest. I will start with you, President Jin. We know that the AIIB is one of the largest multilateral banks today, working on over 100 countries, and that the bank, being a AAA bank, has been playing a very important role in scaling investments, particularly on infrastructure. The MDBs at the COP29 had made now an announcement that they want to scale their finance for middle-income and low-income countries to 120 billion by 2030. I would like to ask you, while there is climate finance increasing, what do you think is needed in terms of reforms of the global financial system, and what has been effective and what not so much?
Thank you very much. As you all know, we are faced with the climate change challenge and other challenges faced by humanity. And all this requires certainly the financial resources support. And where does these resources come from? First of all, I would say the governmental institutions, the MDBs, and the private sector all work together to provide sufficient amount of resources. In my view, ultimately, resources come from the reform. Reform of the governments, reform of the multilateral development institutions. Without reform, it would be almost impossible to increase the financing, to mobilize more financial resources to deal with climate change, the clear and present danger faced by the humans. Now, as you know, the challenge faced by the multilateral development banks over the last 80 years is that on the one hand, they have contributed substantially to the development, reconstruction of all those economies. On the other hand, they keep asking for money from their shareholders. Every 7, 8, or no more than 10 years, they have to knock on the door of the shareholders asking for more money. And this is, in my view, not sustainable. That's why we in AIIB would like to work out a new program and based on our governance structure so that we would be able to mobilize our resources and expand the capital base on our own. But important issue is that all of these MDBs are faced with such, I think, sense of responsibility. We need to reform our institutions so that we should work as a system and do more for the climate change.
Thank you so much. Laurence, you are one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. We have this big challenge of getting to the 10 years of Paris Agreement next year, hopefully here in Brazil, in Belém. And we have also been seeing you advocating a lot for the importance of developed countries to take responsibility on the financial support to developing countries. In this context, we have next year a big year because it's a year that will be discussing the replenishment of Ida, which is basically the resources that are needed for the low-income countries. And I would like to know from your perspective, what do you think needs to happen for this trust and this shift of responsibility to happen, and how you see Ida playing an important role also for the climate convention?
Well, when you look at the actual situation, that is the debt issue for now so many countries, so many developing countries, on top of that, climate impacts are increasing in a dramatic way this burden of the debt. Look at what happened in Barbados recently and in Caribbean with the Beryl terrible catastrophe. These countries were already indebted to build infrastructure that was destroyed once again by these catastrophes. So there is a vicious circle there. And Ida, in my view, we don't have so many concessional, even grants element in the ODA in general, and in particular in the multilateral framing. And that's why Ida has a very, very important role, because it is a resource that should not, never create debt, and really offer for the less developed country a capacity to really use finance in a sustainable way. Because for the moment, in a way, we are forgetting these ideas of sustainable debt. I think because of so many problems at world level, we are just ignoring this situation of debt. And we will only look at the share of the budget that the number of developing countries are really just concentrating to pay the service of the debt against education and health and, of course, transition. So you see there is a big contradiction there. We are talking about new development model, energy transition, resilience, at the same time where countries cannot even do anything but pay their debt. So I think Ida role, and that's very important as replenishment goes until the end, and that's why I'm campaigning as much as I can for that, because these concessional and grant resources are so scarce. And that's why I think it's important that they are used in the good way. We should not mess the different objectives, and Ida should be concentrated on this element, not creating debt for countries and really allowing them just to have a breeze. They need that. And that's why I think the mobilization of private sector should not use these funds to de-risk. I think we have many windows. Look at in the World Bank windows of the MIGA, for example, or IFC. We have many resources that should be really dedicated to mobilizing private capital. But not this one is a precious resource. Fiscal space is limited more and more in many developed countries. I think the replenishment looks good, and we have many countries that have come to the support of Ida, but I think it's a priority to say how we create, and I certainly will come back to that problem, how we create resource transfer without creating debt, which would be, if we think about climate resilient countries, we should have that as a priority.
So very important messages here. We need actually to talk about reforms of the MDBs themselves and not just necessarily about more money, but also the type of money that we are talking about, particularly when countries are poorer and over-indebted, is very important. So we have to be very careful about the concessionality and climate finance not creating more debt. Júlia, passando para você agora, no contexto mais amazônico, pensando também aqui nas oportunidades no Brasil. Qual o papel que você acha, falando agora do setor privado, que é possível o setor privado ter para alavancar financiamento e investimentos na Amazônia, e, em particular, no caso da Amazônia Mais 21, o papel que a indústria pode ter também para o desenvolvimento da região?
Obrigada, Maria. Bom, quando a gente está falando, né, do papel da indústria, a gente está falando principalmente da industrialização verde, e aí a gente tem dois movimentos. Um primeiro que é a adaptação, então como é que a gente transforma essa indústria para que ela crie, né, substitua os atuais combustíveis fósseis, também como é que ela se torna menos tóxica e, principalmente, como é que ela trabalha com os elementos de circularidade. Mas acho que tem um elemento muito importante, que é a oportunidade que a agenda da sustentabilidade e das finanças se abrem, que é a possibilidade de criação de novos negócios, criação de novas indústrias verdes e, principalmente, a capacidade que a indústria tem de trabalhar com esses elementos na capacidade de escala. Então, dada a emergência que a gente está vivendo climática e, principalmente, né, a situação que a gente se encontra, é muito importante que a gente trabalhe, ainda mais dentro de um ambiente como a Amazônia, que tem muitos riscos. É fundamental que a gente também pense numa um novo modelo, uma nova industrialização que promova também a bioeconomia, as energias renováveis e o reflorestamento também em grande escala. E aí, nesse sentido, é importante que a gente trabalhe com mecanismos financeiros como o Blended Finance, que tem vindo como uma ferramenta de misturar diferentes capitais, então, tanto capital filantrópico como capital comercial e também os capitais de fundos soberanos, para fazer com que esses recursos cheguem aonde mais precisam, que são os pequenos negócios que estão crescendo, principalmente em regiões onde tem muitos riscos, e a Amazônia é um desses, mas que também existe uma grande potencialidade de se criar impacto socioambiental positivo, gerando renda para as comunidades que estão ali e para os moradores que protegem as nossas florestas. Então, a gente, dentro do Instituto Amazônia Mais 21, e junto com a indústria, a gente tem desenvolvido essa ferramenta de Blended Finance para justamente ajudar com que esses pequenos negócios consigam prosperar e enfrentar os diferentes desafios e os riscos que estão iminentes em regiões como a Amazônia, e, principalmente, o que a gente precisa é que esse capital ele seja um capital paciente, um capital consciente e um capital, principalmente, que respeite o tempo da floresta também.
Obrigado. Mensagem importante também, então, de começar a pensar não só como a gente reforma o banco, o sistema financeiro, no que tipo de recurso, mas também como diferentes recursos podem ser misturados para tratar de riscos e poder escalar também os pequenos negócios que estão também tão importantes como reformas de países. President Jin, AIIB is organizing next year the Financing Common, which is the largest public banks getting together in the world. It's about 500 public banks, if I'm not wrong, about 12 trillion assets in investments, meeting in the next G20, which is going to be South Africa. What do you think is there in South Africa and the Financing Common that could move on in the things we were discussing here, the blended finance, the reforms of the MDBs, but also the improvements in the international architecture?
Financing Commons is very much important to mobilize the private sector resources across the world to deal with the development challenges and, in particular, climate change. We work with Agence Française de Développement. We co-host this meeting in South Africa, who is going to be the chair of the G20 next year. So I think it's very much important for us to deliver a strong message to the whole world that the public sector and private sector should work together to mobilize as much resources as possible for that purpose.
Thank you, President Jin. Laurence, you mentioned about other sources of finance, and precisely that maybe with the traditional source of finance that come with risk and returns and commercial requirements may not be sufficient or actually the best way to resolve some of the big needs we have for climate finance. Could you talk a bit about the ideas you have been championing with regards to levies and global levies for promoting additional resources to address climate change?
Thank you for the question, Maria, because I do think that it's a moment, even if it looks like a taboo to talk about international levies and taxes, this is a moment to really be serious. We don't have the space, the fiscal space in many countries to address the needs that we have been really, really well documented since the last 3 or 4 years. We know that we need this 1.3 trillion at least from the international community to developing countries' development. So, and at the same time, there is really a justice problem. Look at the profit that the oil and gas company has done. I remember this number, you know, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the profit of the oil and gas company in general were quadrupled. They reached from 1 trillion to 4 trillion of profit, not business. And then, at the same time, the subsidies for consumption of fossil fuel reached 7 trillion, if I refer to the IMF numbers for 1 year. So each year we spend 7 trillion almost just to compensate for that. So there is really a privatization of benefits and the socialization of the cost, really, because of course this is the bulk of the emission that really are producing climate change. So justice first, and because in a way, this principle of who the ones who pollute should pay, it's exactly the reverse which is happening. The people who are affected pay for the people who don't pay what they should do. So an element of justice first. The second one is, so we need new resources, in particular, thinking about adaptation, thinking about even the transition, loss and damage. I was referring to this catastrophe in carbon, but it happened everywhere all the time, just in Brazil this year. So how we get this funding of loss and damage and adaptation, which will not be brought by private sector. That's not true. So we need public resources, but at the same time, public resources that doesn't produce debt. So there are really different families we can look for. Of course, one is, of course, the big transport flows like aviation and maritime. There is, of course, the oil and gas sort of product extraction. And at the same time, we have used in some countries, almost 30 now, tax on financial flows. And there are, of course, this, what Brazil is really championing, which is a tax on the very 1% wealthiest people. And you know, remember, when you look at the carbon footprint, the polluter pay principle, 1% of the wealthiest people in the world emit as much as 66% of the poorest population at the world level. So element of justice, and that's why we need an international effort. No country can do that alone. We need an international effort, a cooperation, and I hope, I still doubting that we'll see some elements of reference in the G20 communique at the end of the leaders. I hope COP29 will recognize the need to work on innovative finance. I know that Brazil is pushing for that because we have a task force now with 17 countries, and Brazil is a champion of it. And I hope, by the way, that in South Africa we will advance on that, because we need these resources, additional, predictable, and that doesn't create debt. So that is absolutely central if we want to advance with more justice, given, again, that the ones who are paying the cost of climate change are not the ones, finally, who have caused it.
Very good. E, Júlia, a gente está sentado aqui, voltando, né, ainda estão acontecendo as negociações lá em Baku. Como é que você vê o progresso do G20 nos próximos 2 dias, ajudando esse diálogo nas finanças do clima e ajudando o consenso lá em Baku também?
Bom, inclusive, o presidente do Instituto, Marcelo Tomé, está retornando lá de Baku, por isso que eu estou aqui representando ele nesse evento. Eu acho que, dentro da agenda do G20, de como é que a gente cria mecanismos de financiamento, eu acho que tem 2 agendas que são muito importantes. A primeira a dificuldade que muitos desses fundos multilaterais têm para trazer e endereçar os recursos para o sul global, para os países emergentes, que são os países que mais sofrem das mudanças climáticas e que mais precisam desses recursos. E esse recurso ele precisa chegar, como eu disse, pensando na ponta, pensando naqueles empreendedores que estão conseguindo fazer a junção de uma teoria de investimento que gere rentabilidade, mas que também cria estão baseados numa teoria da mudança que também gera impacto social positivo, que gera geração de emprego e renda e que gera desenvolvimento territorial. E acho que um outro ponto muito importante, que eu acho que essa vai ser fundamental, não só na agenda do G20, mas também para a agenda da COP30, que é a gente reforçar a importância da agenda do carbono, né, de a gente neutralizar o carbono, e, ao mesmo tempo, trabalhar a agenda da pobreza. Essa é uma agenda muito cara para os países em desenvolvimento e a gente não vai conseguir fazer a transformação que a gente precisa sem combater as 2 coisas, gerar o net zero e, ao mesmo tempo, combater a pobreza.
Obrigado. Muito obrigada. President Jin, as a last word, we have now G20 leaders the next 2 days negotiating. What would you leave as a message to them that we would hope from their 2 days final negotiations on scaling the climate finance and the reforms?
We are committed to provide as much resources as possible to support the common course, and given our reform efforts and working with other MDBs, we we can mobilize more resources from the capital base we have. So I think we can all deliver the number which will not be disappointing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Então, vamos lá. Esperemos que a mensagem seja, pelo menos, não ser disappointing. Obrigado a todos. Achamos agora o próximo painel.